Okay, freedom fighters, we are with Dr. Iain Overton here. He is the founder and CEO of Action on Armed Violence, a true warrior of the disarmament movement, and with a huge journalistic background. He's worked with WikiLeaks. Can you explain that, please?
Yeah, so around a decade and a half ago, I was running the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, and we met up with Julian, and he agreed at that time that we would work with him to turn the findings of the Iraq war logs investigations into documentaries. So we did a Channel 4 dispatches, we did something for Al Jazeera, we worked with Le Monde in Paris to do some print, and we created an entire website that was investigating the Iraq war logs, for which we won an Amnesty Award, working very closely with Julian in the journalism. So this notion that Julian is not a journalist I find particularly egregious, because I've worked with him as a journalist. He was both a kind of a source, but also we processed all ideas. He was coming up with things and revelations that he had found through his work. It was a deep collaboration. Although we maintained editorial independence of our output, I think our editorial findings were very much in step with WikiLeaks' concerns. So within that, we exposed systemic abuses by the Iraqi state, by US military, to some degree by the UK military in the Iraq war logs. And to this day, I still use the Iraq war logs and the Afghan war logs as a major source to continue to investigate UK abuses in the war on terror. For instance, I'm just coming out soon with a piece that shows the UK military were accused of at least 1,000 civilian deaths, of which they admitted 325 or thereabouts in Afghanistan, and a further 100 civilian deaths as a consequence of UK military engagement in Iraq. And these investigations have been profoundly in step with the ethos that Julian Assange basically set over a decade ago, and which I've been really using as a lodestar in my work ever since. I mean, as an example, as a consequence of WikiLeaks' investigations, I teamed up with an amazing journalist called Chris Woods, and we ended up exposing the US drone war in Pakistan. And so if it wasn't for WikiLeaks, the premises of trying to get to the very heart of hidden military secrets, accountability in war, really wouldn't I think be as mainstream as it is. So I've come here today to lend my support as an editor, but also I've written to the US ambassador here in London asking for reassurances that if Julian Assange as a journalist is sent to the United States, how can I have assurances that myself as an editor on Iraq war logs, having handled the classified material, how do I know that I am not therefore guilty of the same crimes that he's been accused of? And I haven't had any assurance from either the US Embassy or the British government that I wouldn't be also placed on that premise in the same dock. And then the question is, if they don't arrest me but they send him, why not? And that's the question as well, because if I am not guilty of what he's been accused of, then he's not guilty of what he's been accused of, because I did exactly the same thing. And I think that argument hasn't really been eked out enough, that this is a terrible precedent for not only for what's happening to Julian with years in prison, but also myself as an editor, as a journalist. I handled classified documents. I worked with Julian towards those disseminations. We redacted the material and acted in an ethical way, but still I handled classified military documents. How does that not make me a criminal if Julian is deemed one? And I would say Julian should be placed on the same par as journalists, because he was orchestrating a journalistic endeavor, working very closely with mainstream media in order to get these stories out. But ultimately, he's in there and I'm out here free.
Wild. It's really fascinating, and as someone that works so closely looking at the documents and actually seeing the death toll that these corrupt wars are counting, what do you hope will come of your deep exposures and Julian Assange's deep exposures?
Well, we're talking on the day today that the ICC has just issued a claim that Netanyahu is a potential war criminal. We also know that the ICC dropped its prosecution of Tony Blair as a war criminal over Iraq, but pending more knowledge and more investigation. So if new evidence comes to light that actually there were war crimes committed by the UK government in Iraq, just as Netanyahu is being alleged by the ICC of war crimes, Tony Blair could theoretically be re-emerged. But obviously that's a far cry. It's unlikely that Tony Blair will ever be, classified as a war criminal. But the point is that if we allow the state to use lethal force without proper analysis of that state's action, then that ultimately leads towards despotism. Now, some people may absolutely disagree fundamentally with, this consistent interrogation of British forces overseas, saying what's in the past is in the past, these are brave veterans. I do sympathise with that emotion, but the principle is that the UK military and the UK government authorised lethal force, which ended up killing civilians. Unless we hold those individuals to account, then there's a fundamental problem. Now, we are currently involved in another inquiry that's happening parallel to this, where the UK government has commissioned a judge to do an independent inquiry into special forces killings in Afghanistan, and my charity Action on Armed Violence has been very, very involved in that. The same principle as what WikiLeaks was trying to do applies with regard to that inquiry. It just happens that that inquiry is legitimised by the UK government, whereas WikiLeaks was seen to be a threat to the UK government. But the two principles of both their ambitions are the same: to find out was there war crimes committed by Allied forces in the wars on terror, and if so, should there be individuals held to account. But the shocking thing is that the only person who has been held to account with any length of time and has not been then released for allegations of criminal activity in relation to Iraq or Afghanistan has been Julian Assange. We know that the British government investigated 9 separate war crimes in the period 2003 to 2011. All of those war crimes were then deemed not to be war crimes by the UK government, despite the evidence to the contrary that actually there are real questions to be asked, despite me revealing that over 1,000 civilians claimed compensation for lives lost in Afghanistan and over 90 civilians being killed in Iraq. Now, some people may find this unpalatable. Some people may say, you shouldn't be investigating our brave soldiers. But ultimately, if we don't investigate the potential of war crimes, then our soldiers get total carte blanche. We've known repeatedly, again and again, that the UK government's own investigative arm of the British military, the Royal Military Police, is terribly biased. It does not follow up proper investigations. Their own Iraq historical allegations team, the IHAT team, has been disbanded. And let me tell you one thing, that Iraq historical allegations team, a team of over 30 people, didn't have one Arabic speaker working for them directly, not one on payroll. And yet they're supposed to be investigating allegations in Iraq.
That's crazy.
So it is crazy. There's an absolute lethargy in the UK government to truly admit that sometimes when you let slip the dogs of war, you open up Pandora's box, to mix two metaphors. But, and war brings terrible things. Unless we apply the rule of law in the acts of war, we then become the despots. And why were we in Iraq and Afghanistan? It was to spread democracy. And democracy comes with it the application of justice, however uncomfortable that might be for veterans and for those who support our troops unequivocally.
Hell yeah. And transparency. You can't have democracy without transparent flooring. Now, the despair of war and the despair of imperialism across the world we're seeing today in Congo, in Gaza and Sudan, all these places are suffering deeply through military operation and extraction. There's this dehumanization that happens, and it's the same kind of dehumanization which Julian is facing through the smear, the media, and the way that the government is going down so hard with the hammer on him being a criminal when they really are the ones we are holding account for their crimes. When you were working with Julian Assange, what did you like about him?
Well, I mean, he's an interesting character. He's not the easiest of people, but I've rarely met people who are fundamental, rule breakers and rule changers who are easy. I mean, we never had a disagreement, we never had a fundamental breaking down, but he was working to his agenda and I was working to my agenda, and that doesn't necessarily mean that we were always in step. Because I think he had a bigger vision about building WikiLeaks, and I was very specified on working on the Iraq war logs per se. But unlike, let's say, The Guardian, I didn't have a falling out with him. I thought of him as somebody who had given me his trust, and every step of the way since then, whenever possible, I have been a supporter of the liberation group that we see here. And I think that if any thinking journalist in the UK must have to have this question: if we send Julian Assange to the United States to a potential lifelong imprisonment, then why would I not be sent if I manage to get my hands on a cache of US military documents? And given my fundamental work is trying to expose Western military war crimes, as well as also investigating the war crimes of the Taliban or Hamas or whatever. I do everything, but with a specific framing that if I did expose, let's say, another US military engagement, or I exposed the UK military, how do I know that I wouldn't be prosecuted for that? And any reassurance that I'm given that I would not be prosecuted is fundamentally undermined by his presence there today.
Wow. You can see the state of fear that journalists are in, and any of us are in, who are trying to just even do our jobs and search for the truth. Iain, thank you so much for your incredible work. Again, just fighting, bringing the truth to the surface so people have truth and can use their voices to demand change. Do you have a message for the world?
Well, firstly, support this campaign, Free Julian Assange. But secondly, also, Julian Assange is merely a human. What he achieved could be created by all of us. What you investigate, what I investigate, is something we can all do. And if you're watching this and you think, I want to be involved, I'm sure they could volunteer with you, they could volunteer with me. I have volunteers all the time, and I say to them, look, why don't you investigate this or that? I've got 9 war crimes that currently I need investigating in the UK. I've got 1,000 dead civilians in Afghanistan that I want to find out what really happened to them. I've got over 150 dead civilians in Iraq that I want to find out what happened to them. Now, all of this would require researchers, it would require time and energy, freedom of information requests, that all of this takes time. And the point is that the military in this country has billions and billions of pounds supporting it, whereas groups like ours live on a shoestring, and we essentially have to do this out of goodwill rather than anything. So the military industrial complex, in a way, does not benefit those who seek to challenge it. Nothing comes of nothing, as King Lear says. We don't produce arms and make profits from that. We just produce truth, and truth, so hard to get, is so often so cheap when you come out with the reality. So donations, research assistance, and just your voice of support. And I think that's what you're doing, that's what I'm doing. And if viewers want to say this should be a call to action, to say, what, my voice can, if raised with others, actually create a change.
Hell yes, you heard him. Your voice is more powerful than anything, far more powerful when we are together than the military that is oppressing so many. So get up, stand up, and fight for Julian Assange's freedom and for your